Welcome to using Nagios XI as the platform for monitoring as a service. If you'd please put your hands together for Bryan Heden.
Hi guys. I'm Bryan with Agile Networks, and we're headquartered in Canton, Ohio. There's a couple of things that I'm going to be talking about today: who we are, what we do, some of the customers that we service. Last year's presentation recap. The reason for that is because this is an extension on some of the things that I talked about last year. It's available on the Nagios website. You want to see, we went from a small and medium-sized Nagios XI installation to a larger installation, and some of the things that we overcame during that process. What were the major problems that we were faced with? Solving some hardware issues. I/O was still a pretty major concern. Automating user management and the multi-tenancy. Further configuration wizard and component customizations. Some of the MRTG overloads and sawtoothing that continued to pop up. Remote MRTG bandwidth polling and Nagios checks. How can we give standard users better permissions without giving them administrative rights? And then our geospatial information system integration with Nagios XI. So we engineer and operate the Agile Network, which is a general purpose backhaul network with last mile agility. We're a telecommunications company, and we provide world-class connectivity to public safety. We're in Ohio, so Ohio Department of Transportation, Division of Natural Resources, law enforcement, et cetera. Tier 1 carriers, oil and gas industry, underserved communities, business and residential customers, and then wireless internet service providers. So here's just a couple of the customers that we service. So last year's presentation recap. 10,000 services and growing across the state of Ohio. We chose Nagios XI and Mod Gearman. It was easy to use and understandable. It had an understandable front end. And then we needed Mod Gearman's distributed checks so that we could have a single instance of login to view everything that we needed. We scaled too large that XI wasn't able to handle all those checks by itself. We customized a lot of configuration wizards and components. We have very specialized networking equipment, microwave communication equipment that we needed to write configuration wizards for so that our engineering department could easily add those items into the network monitoring system. We had an overview map that overlaid our status information of our hosts and services on a geospatial viewport. We wrote a Mod Gearman management and a smoke ping management component and a portal to be able to view all of the smoke ping sites simultaneously. We offloaded MRTG, MySQL, and then we ramped up to meet some of the I/O issues that we had. We upgraded hardware several times. I think when I talked last year, we had already been through 3 or 4 hardware upgrades just to keep up with some of the things that happened. And I did it again twice in the last year. We offloaded MRTG, and we split the process up so that different processes were handling different configuration files. We offloaded MySQL, and then we installed and then immediately offloaded SmokePing. So the major problems that we were faced with, I/O weight was continuing to grow and memory was limited. Engineers needed to see backhaul, sales needed to see customer equipment. We had the department separation. You know, some people needed insight into some equipment and some other people needed insight into other equipment. We had some defects with the configuration wizards. I'll get to that in a minute. MRTG graphs were starting to sawtooth again. I mean, it kept happening. And the need arose to segment bandwidth polling and Nagios checks entirely away from the backhaul network. We needed to move some checks into different logical network segments on the network. Network and sales engineers should not have to be Nagios administrators to remove devices from monitoring. And the basic NOC overview map was fast approaching end of life. We needed a better way to manage our geospatial data, and it could be utilized by more than one team of engineers. So the host status summary and the service status summary pictures that I've got there are from 2 weeks ago, and that's what this instance of XI is running currently. So about 24,000 services, 1,500 hosts. So like I said, we'd already migrated or upgraded the hardware several times. Now the last migration that we did, we threw it at it. 24 400 gig SSDs in a RAID 10, direct attached storage with 12 gig SAS connectivity to several hypervisors. The VM that XI runs on is 24 cores and 24 gigs of RAM. The MRTG, MySQL, SmokePing, all of those virtual machines are very similar. And then we have several RAM disks in use on XI. So my famous last words, when I put that in when I made this slide, I haven't seen IO weight over 1% in a long time, and it's true, but that probably means that when I get back to my computer later, it'll be at 13 or something. So we automated the user management and multi-tenancy. As I said, we needed to limit the views of the company department users, network engineers, network operations, sales engineers, operations, telecommunication customer users, public safety, oil and gas, wireless resellers. And so we had planned on automating this process for a long time before we actually just got down and did it. The manual maintenance for keeping everybody in those contact groups and assigning those contact groups to devices when they were added or after the fact was, as you can imagine, not easy. We built an intermediary database that manages the users, Agile Networks Engineering, Agile Networks Sales, etc. The database links those user groups with contact groups and default host groups. So if I have a configuration wizard for a certain type of device, I track what the default host group for that device is, and then what the default contact group for that device is based on the user that's logged in, based on my intermediary database. I don't know if you guys, how good that is. So, the default host group, the device host group, or whichever other host group it needs to be added into. Is this a sales device? Is this customer equipment? Those are all linked via the mod gearments also. So automating this process allows for as little interaction from us with the system as possible, because as long as those host groups are set properly in the mod gearman, they just pick it up as soon as the device is added. It makes things relatively easy for the systems department. So going back to that device host group that's automatically added into using the configuration wizard. Yesterday, Troy gave a talk on the standardization of Nagios XI install, essentially. And one of the things that he said was during the configuration wizards, instead of just adding all of those OIDs to that device and creating all those individual services for that device, we did that. And it is not a good, it's not good. So we learned from there, or from that, and now we just add that device via the configuration wizard to a specific device host group, and then all of those services already belong to that host group. And it helps out an awful lot with the management. If I ever need to make a massive change, I just go and change one of those services. So we wrote a script that creates the configuration wizards based on a generic template. While it's creating the configuration wizard, it also creates the device host group in XI, and any device created with that wizard will be added to that host group. So I have a group of files, my generic template, an update script, and then a deployment script to the server. I make the changes that I need to in the generic script. I edit an array of information that holds all of the basic information needed to create a configuration wizard, and then I have a deployment script that copies that and then goes through the array and creates a configuration wizard based on the generic template for each one of those. So realistically, I make my change in one place. I can either append or remove from the array what devices I want to track, and then I push my deployment script, and it does everything for me. If anybody would like to see that code, email me, or we can talk about it later, and I can give you a sample. So, yeah, I just went through all that. We assign the service checks to those device host groups. Satellites track, temperature, sys uptime. You know, obviously, I have to add the port checks to each one of the devices, but that's trivial. So the MRTG overloads. MRTG graphs, we're starting Sawtooth again, and it had already been split manually into 8 separate processes. So we have about 12,000 checks every 5 minutes right now. If when it's split into those 8 separate processes, if one single issue occurs on one of those processes, then none of those RRD files that belong to that process get updated. That's an issue. I don't like issues at 3 o'clock in the morning where, why is my bandwidth not working? I don't know, I was sleeping, no idea. Unacceptable. So we created a database synchronization tool for MRTG. I put MRTG QL there because I can't, the name that I gave it was MRTG_synchronization_script.php. I didn't think that would look good on here. We converted our configuration wizards to write directly to tables. You know, we have another intermediary database that handles, you know, the specific OIDs, IP address, SNMP community, and version. And then I'm able to check for duplicates. I don't know if any of you guys have ever ran into 2 network engineers adding the same device with a different SNMP community for whatever reason. That will break this. You know, it will break it default out of the box. At least in our setup, it did. So I handle duplicate checking, and I remove whatever the earliest timestamp is. I just make the assumption that the latest timestamp will either work or that problem will work itself out. And that's worked so far. We split our MRTG processes based on information in a configuration array present in the synchronization script. So I have a cron job that runs a script. I've got some variables set. How many processes do I want to split the configuration directory into, and how many daemons do I want to create? And then staggered every 5 minutes throughout the hour, that synchronization script will delete all of the configuration files, all of the main MRTG configuration files, pull all that information from the database, write it to disk, and then when the next 5-minute increment hits, it just starts over, and those RRD files are updated. So we also monitor the log file for errors and send out alerts based on these findings. Those come to myself in the systems department. If I see one of those errors, then we know that we have an issue, and we go in and manually look at the database. That can obviously be automated. I haven't gotten around to it yet. You can see I don't know, again, how easy that is to read from where you guys are at. But we gather information, we check for duplicates and remove, grab the MRTG data, delete the entire conf.d directory in etc MRTG. How many processes do we need to spawn? And then we rebuild the cron jobs and the entire directory. So we have a lot of customers, and support calls are expensive. We need to be able to give them access to their own monitoring. Here's your devices that we carry. Here's your bandwidth. It'll be fun and easy, they said. Yeah, okay. So executing remote Nagios checks is as easy as ensuring that each different customer's device has the default host group appropriately added, which goes back to the talk that I had about the part where I talked about the configuration wizards. As long as that's set up, then this works. There is human error still involved when I'm typing out that configuration array. If I mess it up, then it gets messed up. The remote mod Gearman really does just take care of the rest. So we changed the configuration wizards to hide all of the default host groups, so all of the ones that are created by our configuration wizard script or any of the segmented host groups, those are all hidden from view. The customer can't check those when they're going through the checkboxes, you know, add me to this contact group, add me to this host group. All of the ones that are created automatically are hidden. So that's all fine and good for mod Gearman, but what about the remote bandwidth polling? We changed the configuration wizards to execute config maker on their remote mod Gearman box. So through SSH, whenever we're trying to get that port information, we just run that over SSH, grab the config maker, as if it was ran locally on whatever probe device we have on their section, a logical network, so that it can be ran from wherever they're at. Once it parses that data, it's just entered into the database and linked to their probe, so that MRTG synchronization tool is ran from each one of those probes, and it pulls the proper information for MRTG wherever it needs to be. So you can see here, I did my best at a technical drawing of how this works. I'm not an artist. I just do the computers, I'm sorry. So, here's our normal Mod Gearman and MRTG setup, performing bandwidth checks and performing regular checks, and how it gets the MRTG data back via, there's a check RID graph or TRAF. So we update ETSI MRTG via MRTG sync on both the standard box for our core network and then for the remote workers as well. It just works. So the network or sales engineers should not have to be Nagios administrators to remove devices for monitoring. And we had to train people on Core Config Manager if they ever planned on creating or removing host groups, removing hosts or services, renaming anything, removing hosts from host groups. I'm going to back up a little bit because all I've talked about are the default host groups. With the geospatial information systems that I'm about to talk about, we have the need to identify a grouping of devices geospatially via host group name. So network engineers do need to be able to create host groups. I don't like that they're administrators. That's no good. So we figured out exactly what the most commonly used features of Core Config Manager were, and there's a hint, it's all of the things that I just talked about. We built a component that does all those things via direct calls to the Nagios QL database and the file system. Now all my users can only remove the objects that they have permissions to. Network engineers can't remove customer equipment, and sales can't remove backhaul routers. That's actually happened, and it's not fun. We've given every user the ability to create a host group, whether they're an administrator or not, via this utility. They can delete host groups so there's no device that's owned by somebody else. It just goes away. So the basic Network Operations Center overview map was extremely fast, approaching end of life. It was extended originally based on the Google Map component that comes out of the box with XI. It had a decent interface that tied the existing host groups to latitude and longitude coordinates and displayed them on the map based on that host group's host statuses, green or red, right? If any of the hosts in that host group were down, then that dot on the map showed red. We tied those locations together by individual hosts and services linked to another host and service of another host group. And then if either of those services were critical, it showed red. So here's our original map. This is the one that I showed off last year. We also had an animated radar layer, and we overlaid that on top. Like I said, we're a telecommunications company, and that was something that was important to us, is to see when storms are coming in. Wireless equipment hanging on towers doesn't like storms, right? So this worked, but the data only existed in Nagios XI, and we needed to be able to export that data to a truly geospatial information system. So we built a geo server, and we built a component that in XI that pulls the WMS layers via open layers. We had created multiple data stores for each particular customer that we service, sales, operations, engineering, with multiple layers in each for the locations, the wireless relationships, fiber relationships, copper relationships, et cetera. And we built an awesome interface for the portal that allows any user of our Nagios XI instance to add locations and relationships with ease. We built an application that parses status data from XI and then updates the layers on the PostGIS system just transparently. Happens once a minute, pulls that information, updates the layers. Now we can log into the Geo server via separate credentials. If we give someone a URL to our geospatial system, they can log in and they can actually pull these layers. They can manipulate that data however they want to. And this is useful for the GIS department and for the project management departments because they now have insight into the status of the network, what's been rolled out, what needs to be rolled out, and they don't ever have to touch my XI system, but they can still see all those things. Hey, why is customer XYZ down? Is somebody addressing this? And more pictures. How to show each of the layers. Do you want to just see the copper links, fiber links, the locations? So, in conclusion, we seriously beefed up the hardware. Like I said, we threw 24 SSDs and a RAID 10 at this thing, a lot of memory. We automated everything that we could possibly automate. The user management and the multi-tenancy has been very helpful. We built a layer on top of MRTG to manage the configuration files and remote workers. We refactored our configuration wizards to be extremely efficient and tie in directly to our MRTG sync tool. And we built our map functionality on top of a real Geo server. So what we're going to do next is automate the deployment of XI instances based on growth and location. If one of our departments balloons, and we do expect some major growth here in the next 2 years, then we're going to need another XI instance, and probably more than one. I'd like to be able to automate that process for the different areas that they need to go and tie into all of those databases that I just talked about. Password change component into LDAP. What's really cool about that is my guys emailed me today, and that's not what's next, that's done. So we have an API that communicates with one of the LDAP servers that we set up, and from within Nagios XI, we can now update LDAP information. That's pretty cool. I got that email about an hour ago. So automatic interference detection and the frequency map. I didn't talk about the frequency map because it's not done and I didn't have any pretty pictures for you guys. But being a telecommunications company with wireless equipment, we have a lot of frequency overlapping, and we need some general insight into that. So we're developing a component that allows the frequency engineers to view all of the frequencies at once, and they can see where any interference might occur. We're going to take that a step further and detect it for them and alert based on that. We'd really like to receive signal threshold alarming based on the GIS propagation prediction. So if this equipment is running at a -60 and it's supposed to be running at a -70, if it was supposed to be running at a -60 based on that prediction, and realistically Nagios is reporting that it's running at a -70, we need to alert the GIS department. Alerting based on average values over time and a percentage change in those values. I want to monitor bandwidth, and I want to detect what the average is over, say, a 6-month period, and then I want to update those alerts for warning and critical automatically. This is actually in the early stages of completion. And then just deeper geospatial integration. I talked about the propagation maps. We would like to see coverage maps for our towers. How many areas can we service? How many customers can we fit in that area? That's just good for business. Not so much for this, but it's a good platform for starting that. Any questions?
Okay, you obviously have a very impressive XI system there running that many service checks, and you guys rely on that a lot as well as your customers do. Do you have any kind of high availability set up for your XI system or any kind of failover plan, or how would you handle that if something horrible happened to this very custom XI install?
Right now we have, for high availability, we're using VMware HA. So we have a cluster of VMware, multi-pathed direct attached storage. If that were to go down in the case of disaster recovery, I've got the data being shipped off-site. To rebuild this box would be trivial, maybe 3 hours.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Nothing?
Not all at once, guys.
Yeah, they're just storming you.
I know.
Nothing else. Leave it all out there, I say.
Oh, God.
Brian.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it's me. Hey, can you talk a little bit more about the geospatial integration? Because I think that, you know, at the end of the day, you know, you had it up there last year that executives love maps, and
yes.
you know, we use them a lot. Can you talk through how difficult of a process that was, pulling the statuses and the data and putting it into the GIS system? You know, you guys spent a long time on that, making sure that it was right. And I think you kind of glossed over, you know, just the difficulty that was and the benefits that come out of it for the operations group.
Sure. It's Kyle. That's my CTO. It's just like learning anything that you don't know. You know, we went into GIS and we didn't know that much. So we learned what it took to make layers and how to segment different layers based on authentication for different users. Pulling the information from XI, we pulled out of the NDO database, and then we, based on what we're tracking via the portal, where we define what a location is and what a relationship is. When we do that, we pull the IDs from the NDO database, and we pull the status information using those IDs, and we push them into a style sheet for the layer. You know, the GIS system doesn't care what the Nagios ID is at all. It cares what should it display and where should it display. It really is a lot of moving pieces. Something that I didn't mention also is that the LDAP server that I was just talking about that authenticates the XI users is the same LDAP server that authenticates the geospatial information system. So your default view when you log into that portal, we pass your LDAP credentials straight to that server. The same view across the board. How much has it helped? The Network Operations Center uses that 24 hours a day. You know, it's always up on the screen, and they get to see real live status data of the entire network. Everything is in that map. Our business is ran on that map. It literally is on a giant screen in a room that's staffed 24 hours a day. And as soon as something goes red, our guys know exactly where it's at. They click on it in the map, it gives them the name, and they can drill down and see what exactly is happening. And then they're able to get on the phone and get that issue resolved with the field engineers. Yeah, 3 clicks. No more.
Any other questions? All right, then. Oh, perfect.
I have a coworker who's getting a bit hostile about losing his control over making systems and services on Intermapper because we're moving everything to Nagios. Now, you said you set something up so that non-admin users can create objects. Now, what were the packages you used? Config Maker and ModGearman?
ModGearman is, those aren't used to allow any user to create a host. For that, it's really just a simple Nagios QL SQL call. You build a component and then get the information that you need from the customer and then push the Nagios QL. I'll tell you to figure out the SQL for that, we created a test XI box, took a snapshot before any addition, used the core config manager to create some devices, and then took a snapshot after. And when I say a snapshot, I mean of the file system, of the NDO database and the QL database, and then compared those with diff. And then whatever changes had occurred, we simulated until we got it right. So those are just SQL calls. Config Maker and ModGearman are, Config Maker is what comes with MRTG. That's what does essentially the SNMP walk for a device to be able to determine what ports need to be checked. ModGearman is a distributed, the actual nomenclature is maybe a distributed job performer. distributes Nagios checks for you when you install it based on the official documentation from XI.
Well, thanks. I have an idea now how to do it, short of being able to launch an XI config wizard just to a particular class of user. So.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Have you released any of your customizations onto the Nagios Exchange?
There have been a few that I've released. Nothing new this year. You know, the Mod Gearman Manager component is available. The smoke ping component's available. I don't remember. The MRTG QL that I'm talking about in here, we're in the early stages of getting that ready for open source. It would be nice, I think, that a lot of other people could use the ability to query that data, and I actually got the go-ahead yesterday to do that, so that'll be something to look forward to. I do recommend the Mod Gearman Manager for anybody that has a decent-sized Mod Gearman install. It allows you to view the status of the Mod Gearmans that you have connected to your system and also update their configurations from within a component in XI.
Any other questions? All right, then. How about a nice round of applause for Bryan Heden?